The keys felt heavier than they should have when Marcus Rivera turned them in the rusted gate lock for the first time. Behind him, 4 black pickup trucks sat in perfect formation across the dirt road. Engines running, headlights cutting through the Texas evening like search beams. The men inside hadn't moved for 20 minutes, but their presence pressed against his back like a physical weight. He had bought this land 6 hours ago. Nobody else was supposed to know yet. The real estate agent had assured him the sale was confidential until the paperwork cleared the county office tomorrow morning. So how did these people know exactly where to find him? And why were they watching him like predators waiting for the right moment to strike? Marcus had driven 1,200 miles from Denver to start over after his divorce, and 20 years of military service left him hollow inside. The 5,000-acre spread in rural Texas had been advertised as a distressed sale, the previous owner having declared bankruptcy after a series of failed cattle ventures. The price was almost too good to be true, but after 3 tours in Afghanistan and a marriage that crumbled under the weight of his nightmares, Marcus needed something real to hold on to. This land was supposed to be his sanctuary, his chance to build something worthwhile with his own hands. The ranch house sat a quarter-mile down the gravel drive, a modest 2-story structure that had seen better decades but still held promise. The barn needed work, and the fencing would require complete replacement. But Marcus had time and determination. What he didn't expect was company on his first night. The trucks had appeared just as the sun touched the horizon, pulling up with military precision and positioning themselves to block the only road in or out of the property. Marcus pulled his cell phone from his pocket and checked the signal. 2 bars, enough to call for help if needed, but he wasn't sure who he would call or what he would tell them. 4 trucks full of people sitting on a public road wasn't exactly illegal, even if it felt threatening as hell. He turned back toward his own pickup, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. These men wanted something, and whatever it was, they had gone to considerable trouble to corner him here. The driver's side door of the lead truck opened with a deliberate slowness that made Marcus's combat instincts flare to life. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, his polished boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the gate. His smile was the kind that never reached the eyes, practiced and cold. "Mr. Rivera," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "My name is Vincent Crawford. I represent certain interests in this area, and I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding about your purchase today." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. How did this stranger know his name? And what kind of misunderstanding required 4 trucks full of backup to discuss? The man's confident demeanor suggested he was used to getting his way, but something in his eyes hinted at desperation beneath the polished surface. "I think you're going to want to reverse that sale," Crawford continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Before morning comes." Crawford pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and held it against the gate's chain-link fence. Even in the fading light, Marcus could see the envelope was stuffed with what looked like cash, more money than most people saw in a year. The gesture was smooth and practiced, as if Crawford had done this many times before. "Inside this envelope is twice what you paid for this land today," Crawford said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. "Clean, tax-free cash. All you have to do is drive back to town tomorrow morning and tell the county clerk you've changed your mind. Simple paperwork reversal. Nobody gets hurt, and you walk away with a significant profit for one night's inconvenience." Marcus studied the man's face, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the way his suit fit perfectly despite the Texas heat. Crawford wasn't some local tough guy or desperate land grabber. He was corporate, polished, and clearly backed by serious money. That fact alone made Marcus more suspicious, not less. In his experience, when rich people offered easy money, there was always a catch that came with a heavy price. "Who do you work for?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady. "Let's just say I represent a consortium of investors interested in developing this region," Crawford replied. "Nothing sinister, just business. Sometimes properties get tied up in complex legal situations, and it's easier to resolve things quietly before they become public matters." Behind Crawford, Marcus could see movement in the other trucks. Men were getting out now, 6 of them total, all dressed similarly in dark clothing and work boots. They weren't making any aggressive moves, but their presence was clearly meant to emphasize that this wasn't really a negotiation. They spread out casually along the road, blocking any possible exit route. "You see, Mr. Rivera," Crawford continued, The previous owner of this ranch had some complicated business relationships that weren't fully disclosed in the bankruptcy proceedings. There are certain claims against this property that could tie you up in legal battles for years. Expensive legal battles that would cost you far more than you paid for the land. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had been through enough bureaucratic warfare in the military to recognize a veiled threat when he heard one. Crawford was essentially telling him that buying this ranch had painted a target on his back, and the only way to remove it was to give up and walk away. But something about the man's urgency suggested that Marcus held more power in this situation than Crawford wanted him to realize. "I did my due diligence before I bought this place," Marcus said. "Title search came back clean." Crawford's smile flickered for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. Title searches don't always reveal everything, especially when certain parties prefer to keep their interests private. Trust me when I say you don't want to find out what those complications might entail. The evening air carried the sound of coyotes calling from somewhere deep in the ranch property, a wild sound that reminded Marcus why he had wanted this isolation in the first place. He looked past Crawford at the men positioned along the road, noting how they stayed just far enough apart to cover maximum ground while remaining within supporting distance of each other. Military training. Or, at least professional security experience. "What happens if I say no?" Marcus asked. Crawford's expression hardened completely, and for the first time, his polished veneer cracked enough to show the desperation Marcus had sensed earlier. "Then tomorrow morning is going to be very complicated for you, Mr. Rivera. More complicated than you can imagine." Marcus looked Crawford directly in the eyes and made his decision. "I'm not interested in your offer." The words hung in the evening air like a challenge, and Marcus watched Crawford's face transform from confident negotiator to something much more dangerous. The man's jaw tightened, and he slowly slid the envelope back into his jacket pocket. Behind him, the 6 men along the road shifted positions slightly, their casual stance becoming more alert. "That's unfortunate," Crawford said, his voice losing all pretense of friendliness. "I was hoping we could handle this like civilized people." Marcus heard the sound of heavy metal clanking behind Crawford, and his blood ran cold. 2 of the men were pulling thick chains from the back of one of the trucks, the kind used for towing heavy equipment. They walked toward the gate with purposeful strides, their boots crunching on the gravel road. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus stepped forward, but Crawford raised his hand in a stopping gesture. "Securing the property until certain legal matters can be resolved," Crawford replied smoothly. "You see, there's going to be an injunction filed first thing tomorrow morning that will freeze any transactions involving this land. We're simply ensuring that no one can access the property until the courts can sort through the competing claims." The men reached the gate and began threading the heavy chain through the metal links with practiced efficiency. Marcus realized with growing anger that they had come prepared for exactly this scenario. The chains were long enough to wrap multiple times around both the gate posts and the gate itself, creating a barrier that would require bolt cutters or serious power tools to break. "You can't legally do this," Marcus said, but even as he spoke, he knew the law wouldn't help him tonight. By the time he could get a sheriff out here, these men would be long gone, and he would be trapped on his own property with no way to prove who had chained him in. Crawford smiled at Marcus's frustration. "Property disputes can be very complicated, Mr. Rivera. Sometimes it takes weeks for the courts to determine who has the right to access disputed land. During that time, it's common for properties to be secured to prevent any further complications." Marcus watched helplessly as the men finished with the chains and produced heavy padlocks that clicked shut with finality. The gate that had opened so easily with his new keys was now sealed tight, and the keyhole was completely covered by the metal links. Even if he cut the locks, the chains would still hold everything in place. "The beautiful thing about legal proceedings," Crawford continued, "is that they create such uncertainty. Banks don't like uncertainty, Mr. Rivera. When they hear that the property securing their loan is tied up in litigation, they tend to become very nervous about their investment." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Crawford wasn't just talking about blocking his access to the ranch. He was describing a systematic campaign to destroy Marcus's ability to keep the property. Legal challenges, banking pressure, and who knew what other tactics designed to force him into bankruptcy, just like the previous owner. "You can still walk away," Crawford said, his tone becoming almost conversational again. "Drive back to town tonight, sleep in a motel, and tomorrow morning you can start the paperwork to reverse the sale. Simple and clean." Marcus looked through the chain-wrapped gate at his ranch house in the distance, barely visible in the gathering darkness. 24 hours ago, that building had represented hope and a fresh start. Now it looked like a prison, and he was trapped on the wrong side of the bars. "What happens if I stay?" Marcus asked. Crawford's smile turned predatory. "Then tomorrow, you're going to discover just how complicated life can become when you own something other people want." Marcus watched Crawford and his men drive away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness like red eyes closing. But instead of feeling defeated, something else stirred in his chest. 20 years of military training had taught him that when conventional routes were blocked, you found unconventional ones. These men had made one critical mistake in their show of force. They assumed he was a typical civilian who would be intimidated by legal threats and locked gates. He pulled out his cell phone and opened the satellite mapping app he had used during his ranch research. The property boundaries were clearly marked, and while the main entrance was now sealed with chains, the ranch covered 5,000 acres with miles of perimeter fencing. Crawford's men had blocked the front door, but they couldn't monitor every inch of a property this size. Marcus drove his pickup along the country road, following the fence line as it curved away from the main gate. His headlights swept across the old barbed wire barriers that marked his property boundaries, most of it sagging and rusted from years of neglect. After about a mile, he found what he was looking for, a section where flooding had washed out the supporting posts, leaving a gap wide enough for a vehicle to pass through. He maneuvered his truck carefully through the opening, wincing as branches scraped against the paint. Once inside his own land, Marcus felt a surge of ownership that surprised him with its intensity. These 5,000 acres belonged to him, legally and officially, regardless of what Crawford and his corporate backers wanted. No amount of intimidation would change that basic fact. The ranch house was dark as he approached from the backside, but Marcus could see that someone had been here recently. Fresh tire tracks marked the dirt around the building, and when he got closer, he noticed that the back door was standing slightly open. His military instincts immediately went on high alert. Crawford's men hadn't just threatened him at the gate. They had been inside his property, inside his house, searching for something. Marcus parked his truck behind the barn, out of sight from the main road, and approached the house carefully. The back door had been jimmied open with professional skill, barely any damage to the wood around the lock. These weren't amateur burglars. They were experienced at gaining access to places they didn't belong. Inside, the house showed subtle signs of a thorough but careful search. Furniture had been moved slightly, closet doors stood open, and the previous owner's remaining belongings had been examined and repositioned. But whatever the searchers were looking for, they hadn't found it, because they had left empty-handed. Marcus made his way to the kitchen and found the circuit breaker panel. When he flipped the main switch, lights blazed throughout the house, revealing more details of the search. In the living room, someone had pulled books from the shelves and examined the spaces behind them. In the office, filing cabinets had been opened, and papers rifled through. These people weren't just interested in forcing him off the land. They were looking for specific information that the previous owner might have hidden. On the kitchen counter, Marcus found a stack of utility bills and legal documents that the searchers had apparently examined and dismissed. But among the papers was something that made his pulse quicken. A letter from the Texas Railroad Commission, dated just 3 weeks ago, informing the previous owner that mineral rights surveys would be conducted on the property within the next 60 days. The letter mentioned potential oil and gas reserves based on geological surveys of adjacent properties. Marcus stared at the letter as the pieces began falling into place. Crawford's mysterious consortium wasn't interested in the ranch house or the cattle pastures. They wanted what was underneath the land, and they needed to control the property before the Railroad Commission survey made the mineral rights public knowledge. The previous owner's bankruptcy hadn't been just bad luck with cattle prices. Someone had been working systematically to force him off land that might be worth millions in oil and gas rights. But if that was true, then Crawford's legal threats were probably fake, designed to create enough pressure to force a quick sale before anyone realized what was really at stake. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile as he realized that he might hold more cards in this game than Crawford suspected. Marcus spent the night in the ranch house, sleeping with one eye open and his cell phone within arm's reach. Every sound outside made him alert, from the normal settling of the old building to the distant calls of nightbirds hunting in the scrub brush. But Crawford's men didn't return during the dark hours, which somehow made Marcus more nervous rather than relieved. Professional intimidators didn't usually give their targets time to think and plan. At 6 in the morning, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was crisp and businesslike, the kind that delivered bad news for a living. "Mr. Rivera, this is Janet Walsh from First National Bank of Austin. I'm calling about your ranch property loan that closed yesterday. We've received some concerning information about potential legal complications with your purchase." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Crawford hadn't been bluffing about bringing pressure through the bank. "What kind of complications?" "We've been contacted by a law firm representing parties who claim to have prior interest in the property. They're suggesting there may be undisclosed liens or mineral rights issues that weren't properly addressed in the sale. Our legal department is very concerned about the bank's exposure if these claims prove valid." The woman's tone was apologetic, but firm, the voice of someone following procedures designed to protect the institution, regardless of the human cost. Marcus could picture Crawford or his associates making strategic phone calls the moment they left the ranch last night, activating a network of lawyers and financial pressure points. "I did a complete title search," Marcus said. "Everything was clean. I understand, Mr. Rivera, but when competing claims surface, the bank has to protect its interests. We're going to need to place a temporary hold on any further loan disbursements until these matters can be resolved. Additionally, we may need to accelerate the loan terms if the property's legal status remains unclear." Marcus closed his eyes and forced himself to stay calm. Crawford had been busy during the night, and this phone call was just the beginning. The chains on the gate weren't meant to keep him physically trapped. They were theater, designed to create visual evidence of a property dispute that Crawford could photograph and present to banks, insurance companies, and local authorities as proof of competing ownership claims. "How long do these holds usually last?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That depends entirely on how quickly the legal questions can be resolved. Sometimes it's a matter of days, but complex mineral rights disputes can drag on for months or even years. The bank simply can't maintain exposure to that level of uncertainty." After she hung up, Marcus sat in the kitchen staring at the letter from the Texas Railroad Commission. Now he understood the timeline that had Crawford so desperate. The mineral rights survey would happen within 60 days, and once those results became public record, the value of this land would skyrocket beyond anything Crawford's consortium could afford to pay. They needed to control the property before that happened, which meant they had less than 2 months to force him out. But Marcus had advantages they didn't know about. 20 years in the military had taught him that information was more valuable than firepower, and he had something Crawford desperately needed to keep secret. The question was how to use that knowledge before Crawford's legal and financial pressure campaign destroyed him. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Drive to town this morning. We need to talk face to face. Last chance to do this easy. VC." Marcus looked through the kitchen window toward the chained gate in the distance, where he could see fresh tire tracks in the dirt road. Crawford's people had been back during the night, probably taking photographs of the blocked entrance to support their narrative of a disputed property. But two could play at that game, and Marcus had documentation of his own that Crawford wouldn't want becoming public knowledge. Instead of driving to town to meet Crawford, Marcus spent the morning photographing everything. The chained gate, the tire tracks, the evidence of the house search, and most importantly, the letter from the Texas Railroad Commission. He uploaded everything to a secure cloud storage account and emailed copies to himself at 3 different addresses. If Crawford wanted to play games with evidence and legal pressure, Marcus would make sure he had documentation of his own. By 10 o'clock, he was driving through the streets of Cedar Junction, the small town 20 miles from his ranch. His destination was the law office of Elena Santos, the attorney who had handled his property closing. She had struck him as competent and straightforward during their brief meeting yesterday, and right now he needed someone who understood local property law and wasn't afraid of corporate pressure. Elena's office occupied the ground floor of a converted house on Main Street, with a small sign that read, "Santos Law, Real Estate and Property Rights." When Marcus walked through the front door, he found her behind a desk covered with legal documents, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her brown eyes sharp with intelligence. "Mr. Rivera," she said, looking up with surprise. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is there a problem with the closing?" Marcus sat down across from her desk and pulled out his phone. "There's a big problem, but it's not with the paperwork you prepared. I need to show you something." He handed her the phone, displaying the photograph of the Railroad Commission letter, and watched her expression change as she read. Elena's eyebrows rose steadily, and she looked up at him with a mixture of concern and excitement. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In the kitchen of the ranch house. Someone searched the place last night, but they left that behind. I'm guessing they didn't know what it meant." Elena leaned back in her chair, her mind clearly racing through the implications. "Mr. Rivera, do you have any idea what potential oil and gas rights could be worth on 5,000 acres? Enough to make people do desperate things. Apparently. Last night I had visitors who wanted me to reverse the sale. This morning my bank called about mysterious legal complications. I think someone's been working very hard to keep this information quiet." "Tell me everything," Elena said, and Marcus recounted the events of the previous evening in detail. When he described Crawford's polished appearance and talk of mysterious investors, Elena's expression grew darker. "This sounds like a systematic campaign to manipulate property values," she said. "If they knew about potential mineral rights and deliberately drove the previous owner into bankruptcy to force a low-priced sale, that could constitute fraud on multiple levels." Marcus felt a surge of hope. "Can we prove that?" "Maybe. The timing is suspicious, and if we can establish a pattern of behavior, we might have a case. But first we need to protect you from immediate pressure. They're counting on scaring you into a quick reversal before anyone else discovers what's really at stake." Elena pulled a legal pad from her desk drawer and began making notes. "I'm going to file for a temporary restraining order against anyone interfering with your property access. That should get those chains removed legally. Then we're going to request an expedited review of the previous owner's bankruptcy proceedings to look for evidence of manipulation." "What about the bank pressure?" "That's trickier, but banks don't like being used as tools in fraudulent schemes. If we can demonstrate that the legal complications they're worried about are artificially manufactured, they'll back off quickly." Marcus watched Elena work, her pen moving rapidly across the legal pad as she outlined their strategy. For the first time since Crawford's trucks had appeared at his gate, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone against forces beyond his understanding. "There's one more thing," Elena said, looking up from her notes. "If this property really does have significant mineral rights, you're going to need protection beyond what the legal system can provide in the short term. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to use intimidation and possibly illegal tactics." Marcus thought about Crawford's text message demanding a face-to-face meeting. "What kind of protection are you talking about?" "The kind that involves making sure other people know what's happening here before anything permanent happens to you." Elena's protection plan turned out to be brilliant in its simplicity. While she filed the legal motions, Marcus contacted the local newspaper, the county sheriff, and the Texas Railroad Commission directly. By noon, he had appointments to meet with all three, armed with his photographs and documentation. Crawford's conspiracy depended on secrecy and intimidation, but it couldn't survive public scrutiny and official investigation. At 2 o'clock, Marcus received another text from Crawford demanding an immediate meeting at the ranch gate. This time, Marcus was ready for him. He drove back to the property with Elena following in her own car, and behind her came Sheriff Tom Martinez and a reporter from the Cedar Junction Tribune. If Crawford wanted a confrontation, Marcus would give him one with witnesses. The chains were still wrapped around the gate when they arrived, but now there were only 2 trucks instead of 4. Crawford stood beside the lead vehicle with 3 other men, his confident demeanor notably absent. When he saw the small convoy approaching, his face went pale with obvious alarm. "Mr. Rivera," Crawford called out, as Marcus climbed from his pickup. "I thought we were meeting privately." "Plans changed," Marcus replied, walking directly to the gate with Elena at his side. "Sheriff Martinez, I'd like to report a case of criminal trespassing and interference with property rights." Sheriff Martinez was a lean man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades dealing with rural disputes. He examined the chains wrapped around the gate post with professional interest, then looked at Crawford with obvious suspicion. "Who authorized the installation of these restraints on private property?" the sheriff asked. Crawford straightened his expensive suit and tried to regain his composure. "These are temporary security measures related to an ongoing property dispute. My clients have legitimate claims that require judicial review." "Show me the court order," Elena said calmly. Crawford's silence was answer enough. Without legal authorization, the chains constituted criminal interference with property rights, regardless of whatever civil disputes might exist. Sheriff Martinez pulled a pair of bolt cutters from his patrol car and began cutting through the heavy metal links. "You're making a serious mistake," Crawford said, his voice tight with desperation. My clients represent significant financial interests in this region. This matter can still be resolved quietly if everyone acts reasonably. Marcus pulled out his cell phone and displayed the photograph of the Railroad Commission letter. Is this why your clients are so interested in quiet resolutions? Because they know about potential oil and gas reserves that they failed to disclose during the bankruptcy proceedings. The reporter's pen stopped moving across his notepad, and he looked up with sharp attention. This was exactly the kind of corporate conspiracy story that small-town newspapers lived for, especially when it involved attempts to defraud local property owners. Elena stepped forward with a folder of legal documents. Sheriff, we have evidence suggesting a systematic campaign to manipulate property values through fraudulent bankruptcy proceedings. The timing of these legal threats coincides suspiciously with undisclosed mineral rights surveys. Crawford's face had gone from pale to ashen. His carefully orchestrated pressure campaign was collapsing in real time, exposed to exactly the kind of public and official scrutiny that would destroy any chance of covering up the conspiracy. The men behind him shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with how rapidly the situation was deteriorating. Mr. Crawford, Sheriff Martinez said as the last chain fell away from the gate, I'm going to need you and your associates to remain available for questioning while we investigate these allegations. Any attempt to leave the county without authorization could be considered obstruction of justice. Crawford looked at Marcus with undisguised hatred, all pretense of civilized negotiation finally abandoned. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he said. This is much bigger than you understand. Marcus met his gaze steadily. Then maybe it's time everyone understood it. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood on his front porch watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and orange. The gate at the end of his driveway opened and closed smoothly on new hinges, the chain marks on the metal posts serving as the only reminder of Crawford's failed intimidation campaign. The morning was peaceful in a way he hadn't experienced since before his first deployment to Afghanistan. The Tribune's investigation had unraveled Crawford's entire conspiracy within days. The reporter discovered that Crawford's consortium had systematically targeted struggling ranchers throughout the region, using manufactured legal pressure to force bankruptcy sales at below-market prices. 3 other property owners came forward with similar stories of mysterious investors, sudden legal complications, and desperate buyout offers that appeared just before financial collapse. The Texas Railroad Commission's preliminary survey results had been released ahead of schedule due to the media attention, confirming significant oil and gas deposits throughout the area. Marcus's property alone was estimated to hold mineral rights worth over $15 million. Crawford's clients hadn't just been stealing land, they had been stealing potential generational wealth from families who never knew what they owned. Sheriff Martinez had arrested Crawford and 2 of his associates on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. The FBI had taken over the investigation when bank records revealed the scheme crossed state lines and involved multiple financial institutions. Crawford's expensive suits and polished confidence had vanished completely when federal agents seized his accounts and charged him under organized crime statutes. The bank had called Marcus personally to apologize for the pressure campaign and to assure him that his loan was secure. In fact, with the confirmed mineral rights, several financial institutions were competing to offer him better terms and additional development capital. Janet Walsh, the woman who had delivered the threatening phone call, had sent a formal letter explaining that the bank's lawyers had been misled by fraudulent legal filings that were now evidence in the federal case. Elena had become more than just his attorney. They had spent long evenings on the ranch porch discussing legal strategy, but those conversations had gradually shifted to personal stories about their hopes for the future. She had grown up in Cedar Junction dreaming of leaving for the big city, while he had traveled the world dreaming of finding a place to call home. Together, they were discovering that sometimes the best dreams were the ones you built where you planted yourself. Marcus walked to the kitchen and poured coffee into 2 mugs, carrying them back to the porch where Elena was reading the morning news on her tablet. The headline on the business section read, "Federal Task Force Dismantles Multi-State Land Fraud Ring," with a photograph of Crawford in handcuffs being led into the federal courthouse. "Any regrets about buying a bankrupted ranch?" Elena asked, accepting her coffee with a smile that had become as essential to his mornings as the sunrise. Marcus looked across his 5,000 acres of land that stretched to the horizon, land that was truly his now in every legal and emotional sense. For the first time in 20 years, he felt completely at peace with a decision he had made. "Only that it took me so long to find this place," he replied, settling into the chair beside her. And that Crawford thought 4 trucks and some chains could scare me away from home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where courage and determination collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe, and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.